The first part of the alimentary canal is the oral cavity, which is where physical and chemical digestion first take place. Recall that physical digestion is the chewing, the ripping, the tearing, the churning of food into smaller parts. And physical digestion in the oral cavity is accomplished by a couple of structures. The first structure is the teeth, which are responsible for the chewing. Next, you have the tongue, which is responsible for the churning of the food, mixing it up. Then you have lips, cheeks, the hard palate, and soft palate, which holds the food in the mouth. At the end of the soft palate, you have a structure called the uvula, which closes off the nasal cavity during swallowing. Chemical digestion in the oral cavity is accomplished by the salivary glands, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. And salivary glands secrete a substance called saliva. So looking at the structures of the oral cavity from a lateral view, you have the teeth, the tongue, the lips, the hard palate, the soft palate, and again at the end of the soft palate you have this structure called the uvula, which during swallowing swings back and closes off the opening to the nasal cavity. The process of chewing food is called mastication. And the product of mastication, chewed food, plus saliva, is what we call bolus. When food is done being chewed, that bolus is pushed to the back towards the pharynx. Now recall, the pharynx is the common passageway for food and air. And the pharynx has three parts: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The process of swallowing is called deglutition. So in step A, food is being chewed. So mastication is taking place. In step B, you can see that the tongue pushes up against the hard palate, which forces food towards the pharynx. In step C, the tongue pushes up against the soft palate, causing food to move into the oropharynx. Now notice, as food is being pushed to the oropharynx, the uvula, which is at the end of the soft palate, is forced up, closing off the nasal cavity. In step D, food moves to the laryngopharynx. And in step E, a ring of smooth muscle around the esophagus, called the upper esophageal sphincter, relaxes, allowing food to enter the esophagus, which is letter F. A sphincter is a ring of smooth muscle found at the opening or the end of a passageway. And the function of a sphincter is to prevent food from moving backwards. So as food enters a passageway, the sphincter relaxes, and as soon as that food passes the sphincter contracts, not allowing food to move backwards. From the pharynx, bolus enters the esophagus, and the esophagus is the passageway between the pharynx and the stomach. In order to propel food down the esophagus, a process called peristalsis takes place. So peristalsis is the rhythmic contraction of smooth muscles which causes food to move down the esophagus. So smooth muscle that encircles the esophagus contracts, pushing food downward. So here we have another set of smooth muscles contracting, propelling food downward until it finally reaches the stomach. The stomach is a J-shaped pouch where physical and chemical digestion will continue. There are different parts of the stomach. The first part is this region here called the cardiac region. Then you have the fundic region. The body, the pyloric region, and at the end of the pyloric region, you have something called the pyloric sphincter. Within the stomach, you see these tiny little folds, right, called rugae. And rugae contain gastric glands. As food enters the stomach from the esophagus, a ring of smooth muscle around the esophagus, called the lower esophageal sphincter, also called the cardiac sphincter, closes, preventing food from going backwards. Once food is in the stomach, gastric juices mix with food further chemically digesting the food. Gastric juice plus food, or bolus, is now called chyme, which is a pasty fluid substance. As chyme passes through the stomach and into the small intestine, it passes by the pyloric sphincter. Once that chyme is in the small intestine, the pyloric sphincter closes, preventing food from moving back into the stomach. Taking a closer look at the rugae, or the folds inside the stomach, we see that rugae are composed of structures called gastric glands. And these gastric glands are composed of a variety of different cells, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And in between these gastric glands is a gastric pit. Where gastric juice is secreted into. So let's talk more a little bit about gastric juice. Gastric juice is composed of a variety of different substances. One is mucus. The other one is hydrochloric acid. And another is called pepsinogen, which, when combined with hydrochloric acid, produces a substance called pepsin. Taking a closer look at the cells that make up the gastric glands, the first type of cell is a mucus cell, and a mucus cell produces mucus. And then you have a parietal cell, and a parietal cell produces hydrochloric acid. And then you have the chief cells, which produces pepsinogen. The small intestine is the major organ where nutrient absorption takes place. And there are three parts to the small intestine. The first part, which is the part closest to the stomach, is called the duodenum. The part of the small intestine that's usually found in the middle is called the jejunum. And the last part, which is the part of the small intestine that's closest to the large intestine, is called the ileum. So as chyme passes through the small intestine, remember that chyme is a pasty material. And that fluid material, or that pasty material, is easily absorbed by the cells of the small intestine. Taking a closer look at the inner wall of the small intestine, you can see that the small intestine is kind of bumpy or has a lot of ridges. Well, those ridges are what we call circular folds. And those circular folds contain these tiny little bumps called villi, or villus for singular. And each individual villus, right, so here's a villus here, right, and each individual villus has a bunch of cells on its surface. And on the surface of those cells are tinier structures called microvilli, or microvillus singular. The function of the microvilli is to increase surface area for maximum absorption of nutrients. Once all the nutrients the body needs is absorbed in the small intestine, that chyme enters the large intestine. The large intestine is the organ responsible for reabsorbing water and electrolytes. So structures that are found on the large intestine or are part of the large intestine are the following. You have the appendix, which is part of the lymphatic system and contains lymphocytes. You have the cecum, which is what we call this blind pouch. Then you have a valve found between the large intestine and the ileum of the small intestine, which we call the ileocecal valve. And that ileocecal valve is like a sphincter. It prevents food from going back into the small intestine. And then finally you have the major structures of the large intestine, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. As chyme passes through the large intestine and water is reabsorbed, what's left is a solid material stripped of water called feces. Feces is stored in the rectum until defecation. Defecation is the process of eliminating solid waste. So as waste is eliminated, it passes through the anal canal and exits the opening called the anus. Surrounding the anal canal is both smooth and skeletal muscle called the anal sphincter. The anal sphincter is under voluntary and involuntary control. In other words, you can control it. And the function of the anal sphincter is to prevent feces from moving back up into the rectum.